I've been an academic most of my life. I've had positions at Stanford, University of Chicago, the Wharton Business School, Yale, UCLA, Rice. I was chief economist for the U.S. Sentencing Commission in Washington, and more recently I was the senior advisor for research and statistics at the U.S. Department of Justice. So I've been dealing both from kind of an academic researcher to actually being in the kind of the belly of the beast and the people that are putting the data together. So I know where a few of the bodies are buried there, and I've been, Australia's not the only place. In the last year, I've been invited to go and give talks in countries from Brazil to Argentina to Chile and Ecuador. There are a lot of changes that are occurring around a lot of the world, and I've been to many other countries to give talks. So, in fact, in the past, it's been a while, I guess about a decade ago, I was asked by the Australian National Police and the New Zealand National Police to give lectures to them in New Zealand, in Christchurch at that time. So, anyway, I guess... Anyway, I appreciate being here. Gigi Foster, who's a professor at University of New South Wales, basically set this up, and others. She's had me give about, I don't know whether this is the 6th or 7th talk that I'm supposed to be giving so far since Wednesday, and I've done maybe about the same number of interviews with different things. So my wife is, I hope, forgiving me for abandoning her while I'm going and talking to everybody. But so anyway, I appreciate being here. So I was talking to a couple people earlier, so I kind of decided to change around a little bit what I was going to do. Here's the thing. I mean, I've been in a lot of countries. Kind of the gap between what people think is going on in Australia and what's actually happening is large or larger than I've seen in any other country. And I was talking earlier, kind of confirming the impression that I've had from reading, I read news accounts and others. People in Australia seem to think that you guys have a pretty low crime rate. In fact, you have a very high violent crime rate in Australia. And the thing to understand is that there are two measures of crime. There's crimes that are reported to police, which is what the media covers all the time. And then there's total crime, both reported and unreported. And as true in most of the world, there's a large gap between total crimes and crimes that are reported to police. But the gap here is very large. So if you take something like rapes and sexual assaults, in the United States, about 45% of rapes and sexual assaults are reported to police. In Australia, according to your Australian Bureau of Statistics, it's 19%. Now, you can see with that large of a gap between those numbers, if I merely compare reported crimes in those two countries, it wouldn't be very useful, right? Because I'm only getting a very small percentage of reported crimes. And there are other issues that you'd have to ask the people at the ABS why they do this, but there's some kind of weird things about the ABS survey. So one, they ask, have you been a victim of a type of crime? They don't take into account the number of times. So somebody may have been sexually assaulted more than once or raped more than once. The ABS only counts that as one case in a year. Places like the United States will count each one of those as a separate case. So the ABS reports that total rapes and sexual assaults in Australia is about 3 times more than the same measure of rate per capita is in the United States. But that 3-to-1 gap is an underestimate in part because of the way they count them here. And you see other differences too. You look at assaults are about twice as high in Australia as they are in the United States. Robberies are higher. Burglaries are about 2.5 times more frequent in Australia than they are in the United States. And that's just comparing the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics numbers, survey to the similar types of survey data in the United States. Now, there used to be an international crime victimization survey up until 2005. that asked the exact same questions and made sure people understand the exact same measures of crime across countries. And they didn't have these kind of weird things that I was talking about in terms of counting it differently in different countries. And at that time, the violent crime rate in Australia was about 75% higher than the violent crime rate in the United States. But if you look at the media here, the only thing that the media really covers are crimes reported to police, even though those are just a fraction of the total crimes that are there. And, you know, I guess you have to talk to reporters about why they only cover the one type. My own guess is more people, if you're going to talk about total crimes or just the crimes they report, they may care about both because they may want to know why there's that difference. But they're going to want to know what's happening to total crimes. Now, there are lots of reasons why there's this gap between total crimes reported. The big thing is just whether crimes are actually, criminals are caught and prosecuted. If you don't catch them very often, people don't see the point of going through all the costs of going and reporting crimes. I was talking to somebody earlier indicating that for rapes and sexual assaults that are reported, only about half of those that are reported end up being prosecuted, and not all of those are going to end up being convicted. So those types of things can go and help maybe explain why you have such a low reporting rate here. But here's the bottom line, and that is, and a number of you are econ majors, economics basically teaches you if something's more costly, people do less of it. Price of apples go up, people buy fewer apples. If it's riskier for criminals to go and commit crime, you're going to get less crime. And you can do that in many different ways. You can do that with things like higher arrest rates, higher conviction rates, longer prison sentences. But there's also something that you don't have here in Australia, and that is allowing victims to be able to go and defend themselves. You make it very costly and difficult for people to go and defend themselves. And that is important for deterring crime. If you ever look at surveys of police, one thing that's clear is the police themselves understand that while they're very important in reducing crime, they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crime's been committed. And so that raises the question, what should victims do when they're having to confront a criminal by themselves? And there's a lot of misinformation on that. One of the things you'll see in popular media is that the claim that people should behave passively when they're confronted by a criminal. And in fact, that's very bad advice. There's a kernel of truth to it, but it's extremely misleading. And it comes from US data. The National Crime Victimization Survey in the United States, if you compare passive behavior to all forms of active resistance lumped together, passive behavior is indeed slightly safer. But the reason why it's extremely misleading, and really I would argue statistical malpractice, is that you're lumping together all sorts of different active resistance, which have different risks to the victim in engaging in. So for example, for women, by far the most dangerous course of action for a woman to take if she's confronted by a criminal is to use her fists, because you're going to get a physical response back from the attacker and a high probability of serious injury or death to the woman. The second most dangerous course of action for a woman to take when she's confronted by a criminal is to run away. Now you may think if she can run away and escape, that's great, but the problem is women tend to be significantly slower runners than men are, and in the process of being tackled and subdued, serious injury or even death can occur in those cases. There are other things like using a baseball bat, though I suppose here it would be a cricket bat, or a knife or whatever. The problem that women face is that if they have to get close enough to what's almost always a male attacker doing the crime, they're in bad shape to begin with, just because of the large strength differentials that exist there. They swing a bat and the guy catches it and the fight's over at that point. And so whether you look at women, whether they have a knife or whether they have a baseball bat, they're still more likely to end up being seriously injured than not. There are other things like having mace or a stun gun, for example. Mace can be effective, but the problem is if it's raining or if you have wind, that will greatly reduce its effectiveness. If the person that you're using it on has had it used on them before, people develop resistance. Plus, even if you use it on them, there can be delays. They're not instantly incapacitated. If the attacker's close enough to you, 30 seconds is a long time in terms of the damage and harm that they're going to be able to go and do to somebody at that place. So when you break things down, what you find is that by far the safest course of action for a woman to take when she's confronted by a criminal is to have a gun. Women who behave passively are about 2.4 times more likely to end up being seriously injured than a woman who has a gun. For men, there's still a benefit, but it's nowhere near as large. It's about a little bit over 1.4 times more likely to be seriously injured if they behave passively than it is for a man. And you see elderly people are similar to women in terms of the benefit that they get from having a gun. You're almost always talking about a young male criminal doing the attack, and there are large strength differences that exist there. So, in New South Wales here, I was looking up the numbers, the average police response time in New South Wales is slightly over 11 minutes. That's relatively long compared to a lot of developed countries in terms of police response times. In Los Angeles, which is a little bit smaller in population than Sydney, it's about 6 minutes. In New York City, in the United States, it's about 8 minutes. So that's a substantial amount of time. And the problem is, even that's a little bit misleading. So that's 11 minutes for an emergency call, okay, urgent call here in Australia. And the problem is, the reason why it's misleading to some extent is that assumes you can make the call. It's not like if you have a rapist or you have somebody else who's attacking you or robbing you, you can say, could you please wait for a few minutes? I'm online here. I'm trying to call up in order to go and get help. You may not be in a situation where you're going to go and be able to go and make a call to be able to go and get help. And so, the bottom line for a lot of this is that victims have to be able to go and protect themselves. I'll give you one. Unfortunately, Australia doesn't collect this data. But there's something called hot burglaries or residential robberies. These are burglaries that occur while the residents are at home. And other countries do collect this data. The UK, for example, collects this data. In the UK, the burglary rate is about twice the burglary rate in the United States. 59% of the time that burglaries occur in the UK, the residents are at home. In the United States, it's 13%. Burglaries, the typical time for burglaries in the UK are late in the evening, 9, 10 o'clock at night. The typical burglary in the United States is 2 in the afternoon. Somebody have any idea why burglars in the afternoon break in at 2 in the afternoon, but burglars in the UK break in at 9 or 10 at night?
Every time people at work.
Well, but why do we care about breaking in when Americans are at work or not at home, and want to break in when the British are in their home? Yeah, they're worried about getting shot. And so one of the ways you can try to make sure you don't get shot is you break in when people aren't going to be home, when they're out. In the UK, though, they want to break in when people are at home. And the reason they want to break in is that they can then force people to tell them where their valuables are. In the US, they might want people to tell them where their valuables are, but it's not worth it in terms of the risk. And not only do American burglars break in at 2 in the afternoon when when people are less likely to be home, but even with that, American burglars spend more than twice as long casing a home before they break in compared to their British counterparts. So it's just a simple example. If you make something more costly, riskier, people are less likely to go and do it. Now, one thing that, one of the reasons why I guess some of the academics asked me to come down here for was just to talk about the Bondi shooting, not very far from here, and talk about mass public shootings. So the thing is, these occur all over the world, okay? And there's certain common features that occur. People may not know this, but there are lots of places in the world that have much, much higher mass public shooting rates than we see in the United States. In fact, of the top 89 countries that we have data for, the United States ranks like 65th in a per capita. People don't adjust for the fact that we have 340 million people in the United States. If you just compare like Western Europe and the United States since 2010, can anybody name for me where the two worst mass public shootings have been? Paris, right. 2015, 130 people were shot to death. Anybody know the second worst one?
Chechnya.
No. Well, Chechnya is not Western Europe as far as I know. But you have Norway, where you ignore the bombing deaths that were there and only count the shooting deaths. You had 67 people that were shot to death there. But here's the thing. I force myself to read the diaries and manifestos for these mass murderers that go and commit these crimes. And the media, I have to say, it's just not things that we were talking about earlier in terms of how the media kind of gives people the misimpression about crime in Australia versus other countries. But the media also does an extremely poor job of going and talking about these mass murderers. If you read the diaries and manifestos, time after time after time, these killers explain why they pick the target that they do. And it's not random. They'll go and they'll say explicitly, and yet the media will never, ever report why these guys say they pick the target that they do. The reason that they always bring up is they want to go to a place where guns are banned. These guys may be crazy in some sense, but they're not stupid. Their goal is to get media coverage, often to commit suicide, but they feel unappreciated. And they know the more people they kill, the more media attention they're going to get. I don't know if you may know this, but the Sandy Hook murderer in the United States at the elementary school, he had done what the police described as a doctoral dissertation over 2.5 years, where he had looked at mass public shootings around the world and graphed out the relationship between the number of people killed in attacks and the amount of media coverage that they got, in order to prove to himself that if he could only kill more people, he could go and get more media attention. His goal was to go and kill more people than the Norway person had killed, because he wanted to get even more international news attention. But here's the deal. These guys know if they go to a place where their victims aren't able to go and defend themselves, they're going to be able to go and kill more people and get more media attention. About 93% of the mass public shootings in the United States take place in areas where guns are banned. You have to understand, in the United States, you're able to go and carry a permit concealed handgun. We have about 21 million concealed carry permit holders in the United States, 29 constitutional carry states where it's not even necessary to have a permit to carry. And in the vast majority of states, only tiny areas within the country guns are banned, maybe 2 or 3% of the areas. And yet, virtually all the attacks occur in those tiny areas where guns are banned. And so, you look at it, and even if you just read the diaries and manifestos, you would know this isn't by accident. Now, we've just finished some research looking at all what they're called active shooting attacks in the United States, which are similar but broader than mass public shootings. Mass usually means 4 or more people killed. Active shooting cases are cases where guns fired in public, not part of some other type of crime like a gang fight over drug turf or a robbery. Anything from one person being shot and missed all the way up to a mass public shooting. And in fact, I'm going to give a talk tomorrow on this at ANU. And it's really interesting when you look at this, because civilians actually stop more of these active shooting attacks than police do. And there are a couple reasons for this. And I don't think people appreciate what an incredibly difficult job police have in stopping mass murders like this. And that is, let's say I have an officer in uniform and somebody's thinking of going and attacking an area, and they see an officer there. What are the tactical advantages that these killers have? Well, one of the things that they can do is they can wait for the officer to leave before they attack, or they can move on to another target themselves. I mean, just imagine if there had been an officer in uniform at Bondi Beach. They could have, waited for him to leave the area. But those types of tactical advantages mean that you're less likely to have an officer there when an attack occurs. Plus, in a country like Australia, you have like 65,000 police in the country. Not more than a third are on duty at any point in time. So let's say you have at most 22,000 on duty. You have a country of 27.4 million people. So that's one officer on duty for trying to protect every 1,245 people. That's asking a lot from those officers that you have there to go and protect everybody. But there's another problem that officers face, not only because there are relatively few of them, and not only because uniforms, and we want to have officers in uniforms for other reasons, but it makes their job of stopping these attacks much more difficult. But we don't appreciate the risks that they face. So let's say somebody's going to insist on attacking even if an officer is there. What will the killer do? Who do you think they're going to take out first? The first person they're going to take out is going to be the officer who's in uniform, because he's the one person they know might be able to go and stop them. One analogy I give is in the US we have air marshals to go and try to fly on planes. Incredibly boring job. And we use them hopefully to discourage terrorist attacks on planes. How many people think that air marshals ought to be in uniform? Think that'd be a good idea? No. I don't know anybody who thinks air marshals ought to be in uniform. Maybe a big hat that's colorful that they could sit in their chairs or anything. Because if you put them there in uniform and you did happen to have a terrorist there or terrorists, who would they take out first? Because they would know that that's the one person that might be able to go and stop them on the plane. And so it kind of defeats the whole purpose. And even though police stop fewer of these attacks than civilians, armed civilians do, police are 12 times more likely to get killed in mass public shootings than civilians are. Okay? Just because having somebody in uniform is kind of like having a neon sign above them that says, "Shoot me first." So people don't appreciate what an incredibly difficult job it is. And the whole benefit of having a concealed gun is that you take away all those tactical advantages that these killers might have. And so, when you read the diaries and manifestos, these people crave getting attention, okay? Over and over again, you'll read things like, if I can only kill more people than such and such did, I can get even more media attention. Well, in the United States, you don't have a First Amendment here with all the hate speech laws and everything that are getting passed. But in the United States, we have a First Amendment. We don't need to get rid of the First Amendment, though, to deal with this. I don't even know how you would rewrite it in any case. But the point is, you have to take away that they think they're going to get publicity. And how do you do that? The faster you can get somebody there with a gun to stop them, and if they can convince them of that, then you take away the thought that they're going to be able to go and get a lot of publicity. And that's the reason why when you read these diaries and manifestos, they explicitly talk about going to these gun-free zones. So, the bottom line for all this stuff is just whether you can let people protect themselves or not. And, I guess in a lot of places, it's kind of assumed that the government will go and take care of everything, but the government has limited resources. The government can't be there all the time in order to protect people. And one of the things that my research convinces me of, more than almost anything else, is that it's the most vulnerable people in our society who benefit the most from having the option to protect themselves. In my research for the United States, it's basically the people who are the most likely victims of violent crime, which overwhelmingly tend to be poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas, and people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly. The stuff I was talking about before in terms of, and look, when I was chief economist at the U.S. Sentencing Commission, I must have read over 1,000 trial transcripts. And what you see is criminals they may not be the brightest people, but they're not that stupid, okay? And so if they can accomplish the same goal at less risk to themselves, that's what they're going to do. So when you'd read these trial transcripts, and what would often happen is that you'd get one of the criminals to testify in a plea bargain against other criminals that might have been involved in a crime. And the testimony would often follow the same pattern all the time. The prosecutor would go and ask, how did you pick this particular victim here? And they'll say, well, we were thinking about robbing the drug dealer down the street. He has lots of money, but he has lots of guns, and we really didn't want to go after them. And then we talked about going and robbing a cab driver, but a lot of the cab drivers carry guns, so we didn't want to go after them. And then we saw this small woman walking alone at night across a parking lot, and she looked like a really easy target. And so we went after her. And that's the type of thing that you see all the time, not just in terms of the burglary data that I was talking about, but just in general. You have to make it risky for criminals to go and commit crime and make them perceive that it's going to be risky for them to go and commit crime. And so, in Australia here, you have a lot of problems. You have to go and get people to be willing to go and report crimes to the police more. I assume that's going to involve going and trying to convince people that criminals are going to be arrested and going to be prosecuted and punished, okay? But part of the process is even just, you guys should look up this data yourself on the Australian Bureau of Statistics website. It's all there. I know the media doesn't cover total crimes. They just go and cover reported crimes, and I've tried to explain to you why that can be a very misleading measure that's there. But hopefully then, if people write op-eds and go and talk about this more. I mean, I've wrote an op-ed a little while ago here in Australia on it with Keston Green, who's a professor at the University of Adelaide. Hopefully then, it'll be more of a discussion. One of the groups I talked to here, and I'm going to be talking to, I guess, on Monday, is some of these gun owner groups in Australia. And I have to tell you, I think they do a horrible job of explaining why arguing against the gun control laws. I mean, obviously, they've just passed this law saying you can't own more than 10 guns. I'm not sure I understand. The guy just committed the crime with 5 guns. So you say, okay, well, 10 guns. And that would have done what in this last attack? And but even beyond that, what they argue is, well, we should go and prosecute criminals more, which I agree with. But the problem is, if you just leave it like that, then the other side will come back and say, well, we need to be tougher on criminals and ban the guns. And the problem is, I don't view it as that type of trade-off. I would say, fine, punish the criminals, catch them, but make it also so victims are able to go and defend themselves. I mean, you guys are, at least some of you are with Students for Liberty, basically libertarian group. So I assume this message of letting people be able to have the option to defend themselves as opposed to just the government doing it is something that you might be sympathetic to. But, one of the weird things that you see with government is you go and you pass a law, in this case creating these massive gun-free zones. People can't carry a gun in public around here for protection. Even the Jewish security groups, even when they hire private security, the private security people who are trained are not allowed to have a gun for protection. And so you go and you create gun-free zones, a bad thing that happens. And rather than go back and say, maybe we should re-look at the law that made it so that the victims weren't able to go and defend themselves, they go and they double down and pass other types of laws. I'll give you one last example. So in gun-free zones in the United States, like in Minnesota, if you or I carry a gun onto school property in Minnesota, it's punishable by 5 years in prison. Okay, it's one of the places that have gun-free zones. Many states allow people to carry on school property, but not Minnesota. So we had the school shooting in September in Minnesota. 2 people were killed, 17 people were wounded at this Catholic school. Well, if you or I broke the rule and carried a gun onto school property, and 5 years in prison and being a felon, our lives would be completely changed, would be devastating. But let's say you're the murderer in this case, And let's say the murderer had lived, as usually the case, they usually die at the scene, as this one did. But where criminal penalties are kind of irrelevant at that point. But let's say the murderer had lived. He's murdered 2 people. He's wounded 17 others. Likely he'd be facing 5 or 6 life sentences in prison. Does taking 5 years away from his 6th or 7th life, he's not going to be alive that long. The penalty is completely irrelevant to him. All you've done, I can understand kind of what might be the good motivation there. You think if I only ban guns in an area, that will make the place safe. But the problem is, in this case, with the penalties, what have they done? All they've assured is that it's the good person who's going to obey the law, because they're the ones who face the real penalty. They may even obey the law even without penalties because they're good people to begin with. And all you've done is assure that the criminal will be the only person that has a gun in that situation. And so the problem with these gun-free zones is that they actually serve as magnets for attacks. It actually increases the likelihood because these guys will seek out and find places where they don't have to worry about victims being able to go and defend themselves. One thing about being an academic is you're kind of used to a captive audience, and you can drone on forever on these things. So trust me, I could give you a whole semester-long class on any of this stuff if you wanted to, but I think we probably have other lives to go to at some point. So anyway, but I'm happy to go and answer any questions that people might have.